In ancient Rome, a wealthy senator walks into a public bathhouse where hundreds of naked citizens mingle freely, conducting business deals while servants attend to their every need. On the walls, explicit murals depict acts that would make modern viewers blush, yet, to Romans, these images were as commonplace as motivational posters in today's offices. This wasn't debauchery. This was Tuesday. The Roman Empire wasn't just built on military conquest and political intrigue. Beneath the marble facades and triumphant arches lay a complex web of sexual customs, rituals, and taboos that would seem utterly alien to us today. From emperors who married their horses to fertility festivals that turned entire cities into scenes of ritualistic excess, Roman sexuality was intertwined with power, religion, and social status in ways that defy modern understanding. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. We'd love to know how far this story is reaching. If you enjoy true, strange history from the ancient world, consider subscribing. It helps us keep sharing stories the classroom skipped. To understand Roman sexual practices, we must first grasp their fundamental obsession: control. In Roman society, sexuality wasn't about pleasure or love as we might understand it today. It was about dominance, submission, and the careful maintenance of social hierarchy. The Latin language itself reveals this mindset. Romans didn't have a word equivalent to our modern concept of homosexuality or heterosexuality. Instead, they categorized sexual acts by who was active and who was passive. The active partner, the penetrator, maintained their masculine honor regardless of their partner's gender. The passive partner, however, faced potential social consequences, especially if they were a free Roman citizen. This created a bizarre sexual caste system. Roman men could engage with slaves, foreigners, or social inferiors without shame, but being penetrated by anyone was considered a loss of masculine virtue. Free Roman women were expected to be sexually available only to their husbands, while slave women had no sexual autonomy whatsoever. The concept of pudicitia, sexual purity or chastity, applied differently across social classes. For upper-class Roman women, maintaining pudicitia was essential for family honor. For men, it meant avoiding the passive role in any sexual encounter. These weren't just personal choices, but legal and social imperatives that could determine inheritance rights, political careers, and social standing. Roman poets like Ovid wrote instruction manuals on seduction, treating sexual conquest like military strategy. His Ars Amatoria, the art of love, reads more like a battle plan than romantic poetry, complete with tactics for siege warfare against a woman's virtue. This wasn't metaphor. Romans genuinely viewed sexual encounters through the lens of conquest and submission. Even marriage operated within this framework. Roman wives were legally under their husband's authority, manus, which granted husbands complete control over their wives' sexuality, property, and even life and death. The wedding ceremony itself included rituals symbolizing the transfer of the bride from her father's control to her husband's dominance. This obsession with sexual hierarchy created a society where the most bizarre practices weren't considered deviant. They were simply expressions of power. Understanding this framework helps explain why Roman sexuality often seems so alien to modern sensibilities. It wasn't about personal fulfillment or mutual pleasure. It was about maintaining the delicate balance of Roman social order through the most intimate human interactions. Romans drew remarkably different lines between public and private sexual behavior than we do today. What might shock us as exhibitionism was often considered normal social interaction, while certain private acts carried severe legal penalties. The Roman baths, thermae, served as the epicenter of this blurred boundary. These weren't just places to get clean, they were social clubs, business centers, and spaces where nudity was completely normalized. Men and women bathed separately, but within those gendered spaces, Romans of all social classes mingled naked, discussing politics, making deals, and engaging in activities that modern society would consider intimate. Attendants called capsari didn't just guard belongings. They provided full-body massages with oils, removed body hair with tweezers, and performed services that today would be considered deeply personal. Roman literature describes senators conducting important state business while receiving these intimate treatments, viewing it as no different than having a secretary take notes. The walls of these bathhouses were decorated with explicit frescoes depicting various sexual acts, not as pornography but as normal artistic expression. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii reveals that even private homes featured such artwork in entryways and dining rooms, suggesting that explicit imagery was woven into the fabric of daily Roman life. Brothels, lupanares, operated openly throughout Roman cities, often located near forums and temples. These weren't hidden establishments, but legitimate businesses with street-facing entrances and advertising. Roman law regulated prostitution extensively, requiring registration and taxation, treating it as a necessary social service rather than a moral failing. However, this apparent sexual openness had strict boundaries. While Romans were comfortable with nudity and explicit art in public spaces, actual sexual intercourse was expected to remain private. Being caught in adultery could result in death for women and severe legal consequences for men. The distinction wasn't about sexuality itself, but about maintaining proper social order and family honor. Roman dinner parties, symposiums, often featured entertainment that would seem inappropriate today. Dancers, musicians, and performers might engage in suggestive acts while guests reclined and dined. Yet these same guests would be scandalized by rumors of improper private conduct between citizens. Perhaps most bizarrely, Romans practiced rite of the first night, not as a feudal custom but as a religious ritual. Newly married couples sometimes had their first intimate encounter in temples dedicated to fertility gods, with priests present to ensure the proper religious protocols were followed. What seems incredibly private to us was, in Roman thinking, a community and religious concern requiring public oversight. Roman religion was deeply intertwined with sexuality through the worship of fertility deities, most notably Priapus, the god depicted with an enormously exaggerated male member. Far from being hidden or whispered about, Priapic imagery adorned everything from garden gates to bread stamps, serving as protection charms and symbols of abundance. The Floralia festival, held each April, transformed Rome into what can only be described as a citywide fertility celebration. Citizens wore flowers, engaged in ritual nudity, and participated in ceremonies that would make modern spring break parties seem conservative. Roman matrons traditionally left the city during Floralia, not from prudishness, but because their presence was considered incompatible with the festival's ritualistic excess. Temple prostitution represented another intersection of sexuality and religion. Certain temples employed sacred prostitutes, both male and female, who performed religious services through intimate acts. Romans believed that sexual energy could be channeled to please the gods and ensure agricultural fertility, military victory, and community prosperity. The Lupercalia festival in February featured naked priests running through Rome's streets, striking women with goat-hide whips. Roman women actively sought out these ritual lashings, believing they would ensure fertility and easy childbirth. This wasn't considered sexual assault but a sacred religious practice that continued for centuries. Bacchanalian rites, dedicated to the god of wine and ecstasy, involved ritual intoxication and sexual liberation as forms of religious expression. These ceremonies became so excessive that the Senate eventually banned them, not for moral reasons, but because they posed a threat to social order. The scandal surrounding the Bacchanalia reveals how Romans distinguished between acceptable religious sexuality and dangerous social disruption. Roman homes commonly featured fascinus, phallic amulets, hung around children's necks for protection against the evil eye. These weren't considered inappropriate for minors but were thought essential for safeguarding young Romans from supernatural harm. The phallus symbolized not just fertility, but divine protection and good fortune. Wedding ceremonies included numerous fertility rituals that seem bizarre today. Brides carried herbs associated with sexual potency, and wedding guests threw nuts at the couple, nuts being symbols of fertility due to their resemblance to male anatomy. The wedding night wasn't considered truly private. Friends and family sometimes remained nearby to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. Even Roman military standards incorporated phallic imagery, with many legions carrying banners featuring priapic symbols into battle. Soldiers believed these images would ensure victory and protect them from enemy curses. The Roman military wasn't just conquering territory, they were spreading their fertility cult across the known world. Perhaps nowhere was the Roman sexual hierarchy more starkly displayed than in the treatment of slaves, who had no legal right to refuse sexual advances from their owners. This created a system where sexuality became another tool of oppression and control, with consequences that rippled throughout Roman society. Roman law explicitly stated that slaves could not be raped because they had no legal right to sexual autonomy. Masters could use slaves of any gender for sexual purposes, lend them to friends for such purposes, or force them into prostitution for profit. This wasn't considered immoral but was simply viewed as property rights, no different from using a slave for agricultural labor. The sexual exploitation of slaves created complex household dynamics. Roman wives often had to tolerate their husbands' intimate relationships with female slaves, though they retained the power to punish the slaves themselves. Some Roman matrons developed strategic relationships with attractive male slaves, though they risked severe social consequences if discovered. Gladiator schools represented another intersection of sexuality and power. These enslaved fighters were considered the ultimate symbols of masculine prowess, and Roman women, including upper-class matrons, developed intense fascinations with them. Archaeological evidence suggests that gladiator sweat was collected and sold as an aphrodisiac, while some wealthy Roman women paid enormous sums for private encounters with famous fighters. The institution of debauchery, young male slaves kept specifically for their beauty, reveals another disturbing aspect of Roman sexual culture. These slaves, often children, were trained in music, poetry, and intimate services for their wealthy owners. Roman society viewed this as normal and even prestigious, with the most beautiful debauchery serving as status symbols. Roman sexual slavery extended beyond individual households into industrial operations. Large brothels employed hundreds of enslaved individuals, while public baths hired attractive slaves to provide special services to wealthy patrons. The profits from these operations helped fund major construction projects and political campaigns. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, sometimes came with sexual conditions. Former slaves remained legally obligated to their former masters, including sexual availability. This created a class of freedmen and freedwomen who gained legal status, but never truly escaped sexual exploitation. The Roman military's conquest campaigns often included mass enslavement, specifically for sexual purposes. Young captives were sorted by attractiveness and distributed among officers as spoils of war. This practice was so normalized that military historians wrote detailed accounts of which campaigns yielded the most desirable captives, treating human beings like any other form of plunder. If you're still with us on this historical journey, consider subscribing to Quick Historians for more untold stories from the ancient world. The sexual exploits of Roman emperors have become legendary, though separating historical fact from political propaganda and satirical exaggeration remains challenging. What we do know suggests that unlimited power often led to unlimited sexual excess. Caligula, whose reign lasted just 4 years, allegedly appointed his horse Insatiable to the Senate and planned to make the animal a consul. Less well-known are reports that he forced senators to prostitute their wives to him at dinner parties, turning sexual humiliation into a tool of political control. He reportedly built a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, then forced observers to worship him as Neptune while he engaged in intimate acts with various partners on the bridge. Nero's sexual appetites were equally notorious. He allegedly castrated a young slave named Sporus because of his resemblance to Nero's deceased wife, then married the enslaved man in a public ceremony complete with traditional wedding rites. Roman historians describe Nero forcing senators to attend these ceremonies, using sexual spectacle to demonstrate his absolute power over traditional Roman values. Emperor Elagabalus presented perhaps the most complex case. Historical accounts suggest this ruler may have been transgender by modern understanding, preferring to be addressed with feminine pronouns and possibly seeking surgical transition. However, these reports come from hostile sources writing decades later, making it impossible to distinguish between historical accuracy and political character assassination. Commodus turned sexual performance into literal spectacle by fighting in gladiatorial games while allegedly maintaining intimate relationships with both male and female gladiators. He forced senators to attend these performances, where he would engage in combat while wearing minimal clothing, turning the arena into his personal exhibition space. Emperor Tiberius retired to the island of Capri, where he allegedly created elaborate underground chambers for sexual entertainment. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated hydraulic systems and decorated grottos that may corroborate some of these accounts, though their actual purpose remains debated among historians. These imperial excesses served political purposes beyond personal gratification. By breaking sexual taboos publicly, emperors demonstrated their power to transcend normal social rules. Sexual spectacle became a form of political theater, forcing citizens to confront their rulers' absolute authority over their most intimate beliefs and values. The challenge for modern historians is determining which accounts represent actual events versus propaganda designed to discredit unpopular rulers through sexual scandal. Roman attitudes toward gender expression were simultaneously more fluid and more rigid than modern perspectives, creating a complex system where appearance and behavior could be weaponized for social and political purposes. Cross-dressing served multiple functions in Roman society. During certain religious festivals, gender reversal was not only accepted but required. The December Saturnalia celebrations featured masters serving slaves and men dressing as women in ritualistic role reversals designed to release social tensions and honor the gods. However, outside these sanctioned contexts, men who adopted feminine appearance or behavior faced severe social consequences. The Latin term mollitia described men who were considered too soft or feminine, and such accusations could destroy political careers. Roman masculinity required constant performance. The wrong hairstyle, clothing choice, or mannerism could mark a man as sexually passive and therefore socially inferior. Women's gender expression faced different constraints. Roman matrons were expected to demonstrate gravitas, serious dignity, through modest dress and behavior. Yet certain professions allowed for more theatrical gender presentation. Female entertainers, particularly those from Greek traditions, could adopt dramatic costumes and performances that would be scandalous for citizen women. The Roman military created its own gender complexities. Soldiers were expected to embody perfect masculinity, yet military culture included practices that might seem contradictory today. Veterans often formed intense emotional bonds that included physical intimacy, while maintaining their masculine identity through the active-passive distinction that governed all Roman sexuality. Archaeological evidence reveals that some Romans may have lived as the opposite gender throughout their lives. Grave sites contain individuals buried with clothing and grave goods traditionally associated with the opposite sex, suggesting that Roman society may have accommodated gender transitions in ways that weren't recorded in official histories. Roman theater required male actors to portray female characters, leading to a complex performance culture where gender became fluid and theatrical. These actors developed sophisticated techniques for feminine presentation and voice, creating a professional class of men who regularly appeared as women in public performances. Legal documents reveal cases where Romans legally changed their gender presentation for inheritance or business purposes. Roman property law contained provisions that could allow individuals to inherit or conduct business as the opposite gender under specific circumstances, suggesting a pragmatic approach to gender identity when it served legal or economic purposes. The Roman fascination with foreign customs included adopting gender practices from conquered territories. Egyptian, Greek, and Germanic traditions influenced Roman concepts of masculine and feminine expression, creating a multicultural approach to gender that reflected the empire's diversity. Roman writers wielded sexuality as their sharpest weapon, using explicit content to mock political enemies, expose social hypocrisy, and entertain audiences with scandalous tales that blurred the lines between journalism, entertainment, and propaganda. Juvenal's satires paint vivid pictures of Roman sexual excess, though modern scholars debate whether his accounts represent actual observations or exaggerated social commentary. His descriptions of wealthy Roman women seeking intimate encounters with gladiators and actors may have been satirical warnings about moral decay rather than factual reporting. Martial's epigrams used sexual humor to skewer everyone from emperors to common citizens. His verses describing various sexual practices and preferences served as both entertainment and social critique, using explicit imagery to expose the gap between Roman public virtue and private behavior. These weren't pornographic texts, but sophisticated political commentary disguised as crude humor. The Satyricon by Petronius presents perhaps the most bizarre sexual narrative from ancient Rome. This fragmentary novel describes a journey through the empire's sexual underworld, featuring orgies, impotence curses, and encounters with priapic cults. Whether these episodes reflected real practices or represented pure literary fantasy remains hotly debated among historians. Roman political warfare frequently involved sexual accusations. Opposing candidates routinely accused each other of passive sexual roles, effeminate behavior, or inappropriate relationships. These attacks were so common that defensive strategies evolved. Politicians would preemptively address sexual rumors or deploy counter-accusations against their accusers. Graffiti from Pompeii reveals how ordinary Romans used sexual language and imagery in daily life. Walls throughout the city feature explicit drawings, crude jokes, and personal advertisements that provide unfiltered glimpses into Roman sexual culture. Unlike official literature, these spontaneous expressions suggest that Romans were comfortable with explicit content as casual communication. The concept of sexual shame operated differently in Roman society. Practices that would mortify modern individuals, such as public nudity in baths, caused no embarrassment, while accusations of sexual passivity could destroy reputations. Understanding this inverted shame system helps explain why Roman sexual satire focused on different targets than modern humor might. Religious festivals provided sanctioned opportunities for sexual transgression that would normally be taboo. Writers described these events with particular relish, using religious context to justify explicit descriptions while simultaneously mocking the participants' supposed piety. The Roman tradition of pasquinades, anonymous satirical verses posted in public places, often featured sexual content targeting public figures. These early forms of political satire used explicit imagery to challenge authority while allowing critics to remain anonymous and avoid legal consequences. As we reach the end of this exploration into Roman sexual practices, what emerges isn't just a catalog of ancient oddities, but a complex mirror reflecting timeless human behaviors around power, identity, shame, and social control. The Roman system reveals how sexuality becomes intertwined with political and social structures. Their active-passive binary wasn't fundamentally different from modern hierarchies. It simply used different criteria for determining who held power and who submitted to it. Contemporary societies still struggle with similar dynamics, though we express them through different cultural frameworks. Roman attitudes toward public and private sexuality challenge our assumptions about progress and enlightenment. While they were comfortable with nudity and explicit imagery in ways that might seem liberated, their treatment of slaves and women reveals how sexual freedom often depended on the exploitation of vulnerable populations. True sexual liberation requires not just individual freedom, but systemic equality. The emperor stories, stripped of their sensationalism, demonstrate how unchecked power corrupts intimate relationships. Whether in ancient Rome or modern times, those with absolute authority often use sexuality as another tool of dominance. The specific practices may change, but the underlying dynamic remains consistent across cultures and centuries. Perhaps most importantly, Roman sexuality shows us how societies use intimate behavior to enforce broader social values. Their obsession with masculine honor, feminine virtue, and social hierarchy played out in bedrooms and bathhouses across the empire. Today's debates about gender roles, sexual identity, and relationship structures echo these ancient concerns, suggesting that sexuality remains a battleground for competing visions of social order. The satirical tradition that mocked Roman sexual practices reminds us that every generation believes the previous one was more depraved. Roman writers complained about moral decay and sexual excess, just as modern commentators do. This cycle of moral panic and cultural criticism appears to be as eternal as the behaviors it attempts to regulate. Understanding Roman sexuality doesn't require approval or condemnation of their practices. Instead, it offers perspective on how human societies construct meaning around intimate behavior and use that meaning to maintain power structures, create identity, and navigate the eternal tension between individual desire and social stability. Where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know how this ancient history connects with your modern perspective. Drop your location and thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the stranger side of ancient history, subscribe to Quick Historians for more stories that reveal the fascinating complexity of human civilization across time and cultures. History is rarely as simple or as sanitized as we learned in school.